Take a moment now to adjust your posture so that you can sit comfortably in your chair for the duration of this exercise. Can you imagine now letting your mind and body naturally and effortlessly respond to the following questions concerning your ability to imagine certain experiences? It is usually easier to imagine or realize the experience of space initially, emphasizing the feeling of space with the eyes closed. Can you imagine not giving any particular effort to listening to the questions or to achieving any of the associated images or experiences? Can you imagine that the ideal response is whatever spontaneously happens to your multi-sensory imagery or experience when the particular question is asked? The nature of your experience will naturally change and deepen with continued practice. Can you imagine that your opening and expanding awareness of your emerging experience is a continuing process? Can you imagine giving emphasis to imagining the feeling of space? Can you imagine the distance or the space between your eyes? Is it possible for you to imagine the space inside your nose as you inhale and exhale naturally? Can you imagine your breath flowing behind your eyes as you inhale naturally? Can you imagine the distance between your nose and your eyes? Can you imagine the space inside your throat as you inhale naturally? Is it possible for you to imagine the space inside your throat and the space inside your nose simultaneously? Can you imagine the space inside your mouth and cheeks? Is it possible for you to imagine the surface of your tongue? Is it possible for you to imagine the entire region contained within your tongue? That is, can you imagine the volume of your tongue? That is, can you imagine the space your tongue occupies? Can you imagine the space your teeth and gums occupy? Can you imagine the volume of your lips? That is, can you imagine the space your lips occupy? Is it possible for you to imagine the distance or space between your upper lip and the base of your nose? Can you imagine the distance between the inside of your throat and the tip of your chin? Can you imagine the space inside your ears? Can you imagine the distance between the tip of your chin and the space inside your ears? Can you imagine the space between your ears? Can you imagine the space between the tip of your chin and your temples? Can you imagine sensing the distance between your temples? Can you imagine the distance between the tip of your chin and the top of your head? Can you imagine the space, the distance between, can you imagine the distance between the tip of your chin and your cheekbones? Can you imagine the space between your cheekbones? Is it possible for you to imagine the space between the tip of your chin and your eyes? Can you imagine the space between your eyes? Can you imagine the distance between the tip of your chin and the middle of your forehead? Can you imagine the distance between the tip of your chin and the corners of your mouth? Can you imagine the distance between the tip of your chin and your lower lip? Can you imagine the distance between the corners of your mouth and your nostrils? Is it possible for you to imagine the volume of your entire jaw? Can you imagine the distance between your nostrils? Can you imagine the space inside the bridge of your nose? Can you imagine the distance between the space inside the bridge of your nose and the back of your head. Can you imagine the distance between the space inside the bridge of your nose and your eyes? Is it possible for you to imagine that the region around your eyes is filled with space? Can you imagine the volume of your eyelids? Can you imagine the distance between your eyelids and your eyebrows? Is it possible for you to imagine the volume of your forehead? Can you imagine the distance between the space inside the bridge of your nose and a point in the middle of your forehead? Can you imagine the distance between the space inside the bridge of your nose and your hairline? Is it possible for you to imagine the volume of your entire face simultaneously, including your eyes, your jaw, your nose, your tongue, teeth, gums, and lips? At the same time, can you imagine sensing the volume of your scalp? Can you imagine that as you inhale naturally, your breath fills the entire volume of your face and scalp, head, including your ears and your jaw and your eyes? Can you imagine that as you exhale and as your breath leaves your body, it leaves your face, your scalp, and head empty? That is, filled with space. Can you imagine the space inside your throat expanding until your entire neck is filled with space? Can you imagine the distance between the space inside your neck and the tip of your shoulders? Can you imagine the volume of your upper arms? Is it possible for you to imagine the volume of your upper and lower arm simultaneously? Can you imagine the volume of your arms, wrists, and hands simultaneously? Is it possible for you to imagine the volume of your thumbs? Can you imagine the volume of your index fingers? Is it possible for you to sense the space between your thumb and index finger on each hand? Can you imagine the space between your index finger and your middle finger on each hand? Can you imagine the space between your middle finger and thumb on each hand? Is it possible for you to imagine the volume of your ring finger on each hand? Can you imagine sensing the space between your middle and ring fingers? Can you imagine the space between your ring finger and thumb on each hand? Can you imagine the volume of your little fingers? Can you imagine the space between your ring and little fingers? Can you imagine the space between your little finger and thumb on each hand? Is it possible for you to imagine the volume of all fingers simultaneously, and at the same time imagining the space between all your fingers? Can you imagine the volume of your shoulders, arms, hands, and fingers all at the same time, while you imagine feeling the space between your fingers and the distance or space between your arms? Can you imagine that as you inhale naturally, your breath fills your entire head, neck, shoulder, arms, hands, and fingers? And that as you exhale, and as your breath leaves your body, it leaves this entire region filled with space. While remaining aware of the space inside this entire region, is it possible for you also to imagine the space around these regions, the space around and between your fingers, and the space between your arms and around your arms, and around your shoulders, your neck, and your head? Can you imagine the space freely permeating and flowing through these boundaries? Can you imagine that as you continue to practice these exercises, your experience will become more vivid and even more effortless? And can you imagine practicing these exercises at least twice daily?